The Agents of Slaughter is back again. Another video about a fucking serial killer. If you like this sort of shit, like, share, all that shebang. This one I'm looking forward to getting into. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. This guy was never apprehended, so that got me intrigued straight away when I saw his name in a little serial killer encyclopedia. So let's have a look and see what the crack is on this one. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, also known as the Cleveland Torso Murderer, epithets achieved through their pathology for dismembering and decapitating their victims, was a serial killer who victimised the impoverished residents of the Kingsbury Run neighbourhood of the city throughout the mid to late 1930s, murdering 12 people in their reign of terror, but possibly operated in a time frame that spanned from the 20s until the 50s, potentially adding another 7 victims to the tally already attributed to them. The 12 known victims of the Mad Butcher were all killed in the years 1935 to 1938. However, recent research has implied that there could be as many as 20, with the best 2 candidates for addition to the torso murderers list being an unidentified female known only as Lady of the Lake and a guy called Robert Robertson. More on them as we go on. His modus operandi was almost as simple as it was extravagant and subhuman. They did not care for your gender or age, they didn't give a shit about that. They were not particular in their selection, all that mattered that you were somebody. Then they would kill by decapitation, sometimes tying the bodies up, arms behind back, etc., tying up the ankles. Limbs would be dismembered, the corpse would be severely mutilated, males were emasculated or off with the dick and balls. Some sources claim bodies were burned, had organs removed, but at least in a couple of cases, or definitely one anyway, chemicals were used to sort of treat the skin and make it almost leather-like. Lower class transients, hobos, prostitutes who had nowhere else to go nor live, ramshackle shantytowns in a suburb with the moniker the Cleveland Flats, a mixed-use region made for easy prey in the depression-hit city, even a city that had been seeing a sustained period of economic growth. In an era prior to the ascension of forensic science, albeit it existed but only in its infancy, it was increasingly difficult to identify bodies, as it became clear that in some instances the length of time between the murder taking place and in the uncovering of the corpse was considerably longer than they first thought. It also didn't help that in the vast majority of cases, the heads of the victims were never recovered, and so the identities belonging to the victims of the butcher were almost never ascertained. There were only 2 victims who authorities did indeed manage to discern the names of. These were Edward Andrassy and Florence Polillo. A third was deemed as possibly being Rose Wallace. Police confirmed that dental work on the body was considered a close match, something backed up by her son. However, doubts remained as the body was estimated to have been laying for at least a year, while Wallace had been missing some 2 months short of that. However, save for these 2 definite cases, the remaining fatalities comprised simply 6 John Does and 4 Jane Does. Andrassy had a criminal record and was rumoured to be a homosexual sex worker. His body was found close to a second, John Doe 1, whose body had been treated with a chemical preservative that was found to be the same as the agent used on the Lady of the Lake that I mentioned earlier. Some actually refer to her as Victim Zero, officially recognising her as one of the butcher's prey, but generally there are questions asked. There's enough there that some dispute it, so it's a grey area, not officially counted. John Doe 2, the Tattooed Man, is his nickname. He had 6 tattoos. One on the left calf was the character Jiggs from the comic strip Bringing Up Father. On the right calf was an anchor under a superimposed cupid. On the right forearm was the words Hell and Paul over a dove. A butterfly on the right shoulder On the left forearm, he had cross flags, and also left forearm were the initials WCG with an arrow through a heart. And yet, from the remains of this corpse, the police actually made casts and models for people to identify, and that, along with such a vast description of his tattoos, not one person identified this dude. Crazy. Jane Doe 2 was the only victim of a darker skin complexion, the one theorised by some to be Rose Wallace, and Jane Doe 3 was the only victim to have a positive toxicology report return. Only some of her body parts were recovered under a bridge stuffed in a burlap sack, spied by authorities only because one of her legs had been previously floating down the river and it kind of led them to the spot. So, not entirely sure what happened there. He's dumped some of the body, went upriver, dropped some or put some in the river to float back down the river. Strange. Anyway, half her torso and her head were never recovered. There are also a few non-canonical victims who were commonly discussed and attached to the case of the Mad Butcher. The aforementioned Lady of the Lake was found near Euclid Beach on the shores of Lake Erie on September 4, 1934, at almost the exact same spot where Jane Doe 1 would be located approximately 3 years later. The headless body of an unidentified male and 3 decapitated remains were all found in boxcars in Newcastle, Pennsylvania on July 1, 1936, and close to McKees Rocks, also Pennsylvania, on May 3, 1940, respectively. Dismembered bodies were also dredged from swamps between 1921 and 1934, and then again between 1939 and 1942. Lead Cleveland detective Peter Merrilow was convinced that the Newcastle and Cleveland victims were the result of the same killer. Such were the almost identical similarities between the victims from the different cities. These cities were connected by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the means that Merrilow was convinced connected the murders and offered the butcher the opportunity twice a day to travel between hunting grounds. Regardless of whether both sets of cases are connected or not, whether these non-canonical victims actually are the butcher or not, the butcher was believed to use the trains as a vessel in his hunts. Merrilow often travelled on the trains undercover in the hope of uncovering clues or catching some sort of glimpse as to the identity of the mass murderer. Finally, on July 22, 1950, the body of previously mentioned earlier on 41-year-old Robert Robertson was unearthed. Although the profile of his death greatly resembled that of previous torso murderer casualties, police opted to treat the case as isolated. When it comes to suspects for this series of gruesome murders, 2 names stick out. One is Frank Dolezal, an alcoholic bricklayer who commits suicide by hanging in his jail cell under suspicious circumstances. Post-mortem results showed cracked ribs that were not present prior to the death. Dolezal had also recently retracted a previous confession to the murders, which he claimed had been coerced out of him by a group of cops who had basically laid in about him. Frank also managed to hang himself on a bed railing that was basically 5 inches shorter than himself, just adding to that idea of not really having much leverage to do that. Suspicious, to say the least. The murders being loosely pinned on a weak suspect could have made some sense though, as the main suspect, identified and believed to be the butcher by famed Prohibition officer Eliot Ness, the dude that was fighting Al Capone, he thought it was Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. Sweeney was, wait for this, a schizophrenic, alcohol-abusing, potentially bisexual, physically imposing World War I veteran who had been medically discharged with a little notation stating that he was 25% disabled. And breathe. He'd also operated within a medical unit that conducted field amputations. This also fit the profile that had been compiled for the torso murderer. The profile stated that the offender was a psychopath, though probably not obviously insane. He would have some knowledge of anatomy, maybe having worked as a physician, butcher, a hunter, and the cuts in his victims would show that he would have been very skilled at this act. As decapitations are generally messy, it's believed that he would have had access to some private space where the murders were performed. Sweeney failed 2 early polygraphic tests whose results were further legitimised as the exams were conducted by polygraph expert Leonard Keeler. Keeler believed Ness had his man. The problem was Sweeney also happened to be the first cousin of one of Ness's political opponents, Congressman Martin L. Sweeney. Ness felt that he would never get a prosecution because of this, and some sources also claim Sweeney went as far as to order Ness to find a better suspect. Enter Frank. Francis Sweeney would go on to commit himself to a veteran hospital with very lackadaisical oversight in 1938, dying in 1964, having spent years harassing Ness with abusive postcards, taunting him about the butcher and such. Years later, writers would go on to insist Sweeney was the butcher, one even theorising that he likely used an abandoned brewery sitting on the Cuyahoga River to mutilate and drain blood from his victims' corpses. That also fits the profile. So, yeah, that is about all I've got. This case never ever got solved. This went on, it still goes on to this day. Apparently, I read on one page, I never really caught any further, but apparently the granddaughter of Merrilow, the cop Merrilow, his granddaughter or something like that, has copies of certain paperwork and reports and autopsy reports and such. A lot of that kind of initial data was lost years ago, and so apparently some of this new stuff's brought information to light that kind of realigns what is known to have happened in at least some of these cases. So maybe that could be a future video, definitely something I might keep my eye on. But anyway, I'm going to call that a day on this one. I've got a cool book that I'm going to work through. I'm going to go down rabbit holes on a whole bunch of fucking different shit like this. I'm going to try and pick some random obscure ones. I'd never heard of this a couple of days ago. I fucking pointed it in a book and thought, that one will fucking do. So, yeah, fuck it. I'm out of here. Adios. Auf Wiedersehen.